kommer derop på Gensmark til 2,5 år ude i landet, fordi der ikke sker noget som helst. Så får en babisuddannelse, så kan de komme hjem, så den ikke laver en aftale, det koster kroner. Så får de resten af det teorien, så har de til tårn. Så står han foran alle i køen, som søger ind for nye, så har han fået en fuld uddannelse. Men ved du, hvad de så er i Grønland? Han har samtaler frem og tilbage. Nej, det er kun i Grønland. De har ikke nogen, der kommer til det, og til det tager en, der kan en hylde og finde sig 2 år.
Jeg kan hans lille, hun føler tørre.
Så vi gjorde det bare. Til de bakspejler, så er jeg glad for, at det ikke så tidligere med den fordi jeg sådan drikker sig ihjel 2 år. Så den kommer det ene sted, hvor der kommer en flyver, som lander, og den vender sådan.
Jeg satte på den, så er det jo en god lamp, hun er bevæget, og så der hører den til det.
Ja, så kommer de på en fedt.
Hej med dig. Helt godt.
Jeg tror, det er helt lige så længe.
Danmark skal have nogle TM-systemer til styring af kommercielle bruger. Så vi har et STC-system, så vi har et TM-system, som tager alt trafik under 3.000 fod helt til jorden. Det system skal bygges op. Der kommer et mandat om meget kort tid, og det skal være på plads. Der kommer et flyve, nogle er effektivt, som ved, hvor de igen. Det er fedt, at man er ved. Det kan man mærke, at der er ikke særlig omstillingsparat organisation i digitalt. Okay, ja. Jeg var kommet med i relation til den. Det er et dronesystem, det er et dronesystem, som jeg er inde i. Så vi er nødt til at finde en anden standarder, konsensusstandarder. Derfor laver jeg hans eget. Jeg havde snakket med nogle firma, som kunne lave det, men simpelthen nødt til at lige åbne øjnene over. Når du er højere op, så kigge ud over det, og så sige, der kommer af standarder, fordi I kan ikke bare lave det første. I kommer til at lave sådan en rigtig SAS-løsning.
Ja, lige præcis.
Vi kører noget, der synes, der er spændende, og lige ved at få det til en god pris, lige ved launchkosten på det. Så vi skifter igen om 3 år.
Nu er det sådan en lille kommunikation, der er med corona. Så er det nye København, vi har anlagt pladsen derinde. Men vi bruger det jo til at komme der nogen, der har planlagt for nogen.
Den plads ind med Katrine Svinde, den Sydhavn.
Jeg har faktisk gang i 8 pladser, hvor det her er så det første. Det er i København. I New Zealand, der er vindmøllerne, så det er ude på benzin. 246.000 fra rundt. Så der er plads nok. Det står også der vindmøller, der er faktisk lige der, hvor vi har pladsen nu. Den er færdig. Så vindmøller.
Okay.
Jo, der er den i vejen, men vi har bare et prøve, så vi ligger længere hen, og vi er 60 meter fra kernen til mig. Der er meget prøve. Der er det.
Jeg kender ikke personen, jeg kan godt sige noget før.
Jeg har også set, der ligger også ikke rigtig her, og så er der nogen, der sælger kontakt. Det er fantastisk, der er så. Lige selv på byen, der er vi lige med, der er meget små planer. Så er det nye, det der skidsmål. Så det er fantastisk, det er vi tæt på byen, tæt på lufthavn og så videre. Og lige præcis det 5 km.
Jeg er jo ret ude på solen.
Det er ikke en strøm, så jeg kan ud til lufthavn.
Nej, det er sikkert ikke trafiksoven, men nu for de 5 km radius og uden for en lufthavn.
Okay, can you please take your seats? We would like to continue.
Nej, det er en anden plads, jeg tænker på. Den ligger nede ved Stamholm. Ja, vi har en sige.
Det er mest udryk med den, på den mølle bare så. Der er det jo problem. Der er vi høje dyre.
Det byggeri er det enten lidt det ligger.
Nej, det var det udbygning.
Brandpark. Og det er lidt ude på siden også af lufthavnen.
Ja, hvor godt.
Man gør det slet ikke på plads, og den tværbanen bliver lagt ned igen.
Okay, now we come to the second half of the presentation on new basic regulation. And it's again, don't be surprised, Michael Gerhardt and the colleagues talking about non-installed equipment. Michael.
Thank you, Markus. What you didn't hear was that in our bilateral talk he just complained that it's again me. So I have to talk to Markus for next year's agenda, but I hope that you still bear with me or even enjoy the presentation. So what we have in mind now, we continue the topic of new basic regulation, and we wanted to introduce to you a new concept that has been introduced in that new basic act and that we have to now look at and implement in part 21. So we're talking about the new non-installed equipment, NIE, what the abbreviation that we are using for that. Maybe I'm going to explain you a little bit more what we think is NIE and what the basic regulation determines what NIE should be, but maybe just for the sake of the exercise, for the beginning of the presentation, think about an emergency parachute, think about a cargo tracking device, something that is not part of the type design, but that is brought into the aircraft and could have a safety effect. And it's not always brought into the same aircraft, but it can also move between aircraft. So if we start from the picture of the old basic regulation, if you still remember Regulation 216/2008 and the chapter on, or it was an article at that point in time, Article 5, on how to ensure initial airworthiness, on how to ensure airworthiness. It was addressed to the product only. Airworthiness was ensured by the product, aircraft engine propeller, holding a type certificate or restricted type certificate, and then the individual aircrafts being produced holding a C of A, a restricted C of A, or a permit to fly. In addition, there was a possibility to also approve parts and appliances which were later installed into the aircraft. So it became part of the type design. That was the status under the old basic regulation. There was nothing regulated for the airworthiness of equipment that was not installed and was never supposed to be installed in the aircraft. And that has changed with the regulation from last year. There's now a new article, Article 13 in the regulation, which says the design of non-installed equipment shall be subject to certification and shall be issued with a certificate. It's totally new, a new animal in the system. I omitted here deliberately a couple of words in the beginning of the sentence in the parenthesis. There is an important addition to that. I will come back to that in 2 slides. So why was the basic regulation changed for that? Why is it necessary, on top of certifying the product, to also certify non-installed equipment? The reason is fairly simple, because also from that equipment there could be a safety effect. The aircraft, the products could suffer from an ineffective, non-well-functioning equipment that is brought into the aircraft. We've tried to put here on slides some examples, but it's surely not exclusive. It could, the equipment could have electromagnetic emissions, provide incorrect flight information, could lead to an uncontained fire, leakages, and non-provisions of the intended function in case of an emergency. So they do have a safety effect. And the idea of the legislator, of the Parliament and the Council, by including this certification requirement, was to also address this in order to ensure that we have an even safer aviation. And as I mentioned before, the previous basic regulation didn't had such a provision, so there was no possibility to certify something like an emergency parachute. We tried to cope and to mitigate that in the past by using the ETSO process and considering them being parts or appliances. We, for example, did that for the parachutes. So you find an ETSO C23F, or for containers in C92D. And we also had received, before the basic regulation was changed, requests from you, from industry, to also certify certain equipment that is not qualified as parts or appliances. The electronic flight bag is always used as an example for that. And this reason why to introduce this certification requirement is also reflected in something else that has changed in the basic regulation, namely in Annex 2, the essential requirements for airworthiness. They are basically unchanged compared to the basic regulation, but a new point or new paragraph 1.4 has been introduced in the essential requirements for airworthiness. And it has only 3 subparagraphs, but it shows also the reason why this non-installed equipment shall be certified. The requirement that we need to ensure, that we need to implement in Part 21 is that the non-installed equipment must perform its safety functions or functions relevant for safety as intended or under any foreseeable operational conditions, unless that function can also be performed by other means. The non-installed equipment must be operable without needing exceptional skills or strengths. And the non-installed equipment, whether functioning properly or improperly, must not reduce safety and must not adversely affect the proper functioning of any other equipment system or appliance. So these are the requirements set in the basic regulation. So if we want to ensure the safety benefit through a certification, additional new certification of non-installed equipment, we now need to see what is non-installed equipment. And in the basic regulation, you will now find a definition in Article 3.29 that qualifies equipment as non-installed equipment if it meets 4 criteria. It's any instrument, equipment, mechanism, apparatus, appurtenance, software or accessory, which is carried on board of an aircraft by the aircraft operator. First important condition, not by a passenger, for example, which is not a part, so a clear distinction between the ETSO part, the article, and non-installed equipment, and which is used or intended to be used in operating or controlling an aircraft, supporting the occupant's survivability, or which could impact the safe operation of the aircraft. And considering that there's also a definition of part in the basic regulation, which I've put in small letters underneath the box, which is any element of a product as defined by the product's type design, you'll see that the non-installed equipment is not part of the type design which is certified under the TC. So this is a quite broad definition, and a lot of equipment could meet that definition. So we have to see what kind of non-installed equipment really needs an additional certification. And here it's important, the letters that I have omitted from my first slide. So in the orange box here on the right-hand side, coming back to Article 13, it starts with the sentence where the delegated act referred to in Article 19 so provide. The design of non-installed equipment shall be subject to certification. So we have to decide in Part 21 where there is a safety benefit of certifying non-installed equipment and define properly in Part 21 what has to undergo this additional certification. It's by no means said in the basic regulation, and we will certainly not say in Part 21 in the future, that everything that meets the definition of Article 329 has to be certified. So we have to identify in the delegated act, so in our case Part 21 is a delegated act to the basic regulation, we will have to define what non-installed equipment requires certification. And that is one important bit of the rulemaking task. We have to assess the safety needs, the impacts, do a properly regulatory impact assessment in identifying which non-installed equipment in the future requires certification. To give you a bit of an idea, yeah, that is an important, sorry, I forgot this one. We also have to consider that certain non-installed equipment may sometimes be also part of the type design. So an equipment like a headset could, if so decided by the TC holder, be part of the type design and part of the TC. If it's not part of the type design, it can also be non-installed equipment. So the two processes should not be too different, because the same equipment can be at one point in time a part, for another, in another point of time can be a non-installed equipment. To give you a bit of an idea of what we consider at the moment requiring certification, there is an additional safety need for certification. And important is it's work in progress. We have started the discussion. We are trying to define where is the safety benefit. But what you could imagine is that certain equipment can be, like the headset, sometimes be a part or a non-installed equipment, depending on its use. So we do have examples like the headphones that today already have an ETSO, or for which we have an ETSO, which can receive an ETSO authorization. So these equipment we can easily also qualify as a non-installed equipment if they can also be used outside of the type design for certain uses. So that could be an example, but really question mark we are discussing could be an example for non-installed equipment in the future. As I mentioned in the beginning, we also have certain parts today for which we have an ETSO, but if you would strictly apply the definition of part to this equipment, they are not qualifying in the future any longer as being a part. It's rather non-installed equipment, like life preservers. So we could clean up ETSO, and for those parts which are really non-installed equipment, take them out of the ETSO world and put them into the NIE world in the future. There's also equipment where today in other regulations there's a need to certify them, to approve them, like in the ops rules, for example. So also these ones we could submit to the certification of non-installed equipment. And we are also considering other examples. The examples that were used when the basic regulation was discussed, which I put here as pictures underneath the dotted line, were the emergency parachutes, the electronic flight bag, the cargo tracking devices, what I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. So clear equipment that is not, at least for the parachutes and the tracking devices, never part of the type design, but which could have a safety effect if there's a malfunction. So we could consider some of them qualifying as non-installed equipment and require certification in the future. We are carefully reviewing this topic. It's one of the most important topics now at the beginning of the rulemaking task, because we want to understand the scope of this new certification requirement. We have to conduct impact assessments. We have to see what the consequences are. It doesn't make sense to certify small equipment which have a limited safety benefit, make them subject to a certification process. In one of our advisory bodies in the DM Tech, the first example that was given by one of the colleagues was for certain pilots, depending on your classes, you cannot operate your aircraft without the classes. Is that non-installed equipment, yes or no? Shall we certify the classes? I find that a very good example, but it will not end up in this NIE world. What I personally expect, looking at the discussion that we have currently internally, is that we will certainly start with a very limited number of list of non-installed equipment that will be in the future subject to a certification process, and we will clearly identify the safety benefit, or on the other hand the safety risk if there's a malfunction that makes sense that we require a certification for that non-installed equipment. So when we know what non-installed equipments are, we also have to look at the certification process that we want to establish. And there we have different options, we are considering different possibilities, but there are certain things that are already pretty clear, and we would also like to introduce them to you to give you an idea in which direction it goes. You will hear more about these proposals. We will certainly involve you. We will also go for a public consultation through an NPA. But to give you an idea in which direction what we are looking at, we would like to give you some indications. My colleague Karen Garvey is taking over.
Thank you, Michael. I think when you think about NIE, we think about this being a new entity. But if you consider a product or a part, it has to meet some kind of requirements, and the requirements are contained in the essential requirements in the new Annex 2. And it's up to Part 21 to define how we treat those. But if you think of it as being a product or a part, we go through a process. And that process, first of all, we have to define what the article has to comply with. What is the certification basis? What are the specifications? And we could do that through having some kind of generic certification specifications. We could use industry standards, or we could have equipment-specific certification specifications. So that's the what. What does the article have to do? Then we have to look at the entity or the organization which is designing those articles, and we want them to have some kind of competence. So we could do that through a DOA, an AP DOA, or, as you mentioned earlier, we have new tools within the new basic regulation. We could consider a declared design organization for certain classifications of non-install equipment. Again, in the same way as a product or a part, we want the actual article that's been manufactured to comply with the design that's been approved. So we'd have to look at that element of non-install equipment. And likewise, the organization that's actually manufacturing these articles, repeatedly, we want them to be conforming with the design, and we want to ensure that this organization is competent. Again, we could do that through a POA, or if the risk is low, we could do that through a declared production organization. And again, we don't want to just throw these articles out into the world. We want to ensure that the operators that are using them, or have the instructions to be able to use them in the safe way within the limitations of what the article can do. The word proportionality has been used a number of times, but I think it's fair to say that one size does not fit all. We can't keep applying the same rigid regulations to everything when the risk doesn't necessarily justify the level of rigor. So we could provide a proportionate regulatory process for NIE. And how would that work? Well, we could define different classes of NIE based upon the risk using some kind of criteria. So we could state, for example, the criticality of a certain NIE is minor or major, and use that as a metric to measure the classification of it. So if you imagine a sliding scale, I don't know how many classes we are thinking of, but we could 3, 4, 5, 6 classes, or even 3 of NIE, and then based upon those, we would classify what the organizational requirements could be. So for higher risk, we might require more rigid organizational requirements. For lower risk, we might be more loose and look at declarations with oversight based upon the classification of that NIE. We could decide that an organization approval is not necessarily required, and we could quite happily look at the risk of the article and think that actually we could live with a declaration of design capability. And we could actually look at a declaration for compliance of that article. We could build a system where we have the process and the regulatory requirements in Part 21, and then in a dedicated CS or a partner CS, define the classification, and that would then signpost you to what the organizational requirements are and the certification process you need to follow. So the two would very much link together, so you know that for a certain article, this is a class X. I can look in Part 21 and find the process I have to follow. In order to build that process, we'd have to look at different options. And again, we're considering the regulatory impact of these different options. Obviously, we could just slot NIE into the existing ETSO process, but these different options have different advantages and disadvantages. If we just put it straight into the ETSO process, the disadvantage would be it might not be entirely proportionate. We only have 2 levels of risk within the current ETSO process. We could decide to, in parallel, develop an NIE process which sits alongside the ETSO process, and there we could be as proportionate as we wanted to be and develop a parallel system. But again, there could be an issue with interconnection between the processes and also disproportionality between the two. Or we could go for the Big Bang and look at a process where we combine NIE and ETSO parts into a single process with a different regulatory outcome at the end and reclassify some of the ETSO aspects. Or we could think of something else. And we're currently at that decision stage where we're looking at the different options and considering those in terms of safety benefits and also organizational benefit. We've talked about declarations a few times already, but at the end of whatever certification process we decide, a certificate would be issued either by EASA or possibly, if we would permit that, an approved organization could do so under privilege. Or, if we consider the risk of the article is low, we could possibly permit the declaration of compliance with the certification specifications. So you can see we're exploring different options to try and have a smooth transition from high risk to low risk and not try the one-size-fits-all approach. The next steps for this rulemaking task, again, we're evaluating the different options and the regulatory impact of doing so. We're engaging with stakeholders, we're talking to them. We're looking at development of a proposal for that ultimately with an NPA which will be consulted. We will then develop an opinion and hopefully very soon NIE will be adopted into Part 21. That concludes the session on NIE.
And the idea of this presentation was to explain to you the first ideas on the concept and to get your immediate feedback. And I think the number of questions registered in Slido shows that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. Some of them can easily be answered by the colleagues right away, but some others are exactly the reason why we raised this point with you, because we need your input to set up the system in the right way. Yes? Michael, you want to start with some of the questions on Slido? Or Carl?
Yeah, for fire extinguishing bottles, I'm not sure if we want to try and, we could spend all morning looking at different options, whether they're in scope or outside of scope. Again, I want to try and avoid examples. As soon as you think about examples of NIE, it closes down your thinking into how you can categorize it and how you can work with it. Again, a defibrillator, we'd have to consider that. We're going to look at the risk classification and criteria. I think generally, if it's not currently required to be certified, then we're not going to go certification shopping and look for new articles just to certify them. iPads. The question on iPads, in terms of EFBs, again, one of the options we're considering is doesn't a production organization necessarily be required for those when the actual design relates to software, purely software? We could build in an option within the NIE process where if there's no physical outcome, no physical product, perhaps we could live with a declaration of compliance for production, or we could actually look at no production organization being required at all. Loose equipment, I think loose equipment, unless it's being used to operate the aircraft and falls within the definition of NIE, then I think there's a clear distinction between the two of those. I don't think loose equipment could be considered to be NIE unless it's being used to operate the aircraft. pillows and blankets? I don't think so, unless it affects the safety of the aircraft. Please.
Just from looking at the question, it seems that the most interest is to see what kind of equipment really requires certification in the future. But this is actually the discussion that we have internally. So we have to make for all of these things a risk assessment and see whether it's necessary for safety benefit to submit them to the certification process. And in accordance with that, then build the scope of the requirements in Part 21. But here it's difficult to say whether in the future these kind of equipments will fall under or not.
Michael, maybe one of the questions from Franz Redak about containers currently having an ETSO authorization, would it mean removal of the ETSO, and how is it working also with the FAA? But I think you're mixing two different things on this, because you still could get an ETSO even if it's an NIE.
So there are two aspects to that. If the equipment can also be part of the type design, then it could receive an ETSO authorization and a non-installed equipment certification both, if it qualifies for both processes. If it's equipment that today, with the new definitions in Part 21 for parts and non-installed equipment, is not a part any longer, does not meet the definition of part any longer, and depending on how we build the process, we may take that out of CS ETSO and submit that to then the non-installed equipment process. So does NIE spell the demise of COTS? There is no relation to commercial off-the-shelf parts, no. So how do airline operators know what NIE are and what prevents them from having them in the aircraft without certification? So we're also looking at the link between then Part 21 and OPS in that respect. If something is subject to a certification as non-installed equipment, this will be clearly visible. As Carl mentioned, one of the options that we have is maybe to use something very similar as the CS ETSO process. So there could be something like CS NIE in the future, then clearly identifying this equipment, this kind of equipment, tracking devices, require certification so that it's known, and the link in the OPS regulation will be built under whether and under which conditions this equipment can be brought into the aircraft. Ideally, there should be no additional check from the operators or no additional actions from the operators if the equipment is certified.
I think, Gilles, your question on the fees is maybe a bit early because we are just talking about the concept, but for sure it needs to be reflected then in an update of the fees and charges regulation. But that is part of the discussion about the complexity, self-declaration, what kind of involvement of the EASA or the NAAs for the production is required. So it's a valid question, but maybe a bit too early.
And we note for the minutes of the meeting that Dassault is ready to pay fees. Thank you. There was a question on retrospect. Yeah, how will non-installed equipment be retrospectively applied to equipment currently operational, approved, and in service? We do have to make that assessment, whether it's worthwhile to apply the rules retrospectively, but I can't imagine that that is necessary. So very, very likely no consequences on what is approved already.
I think we will record all the questions and come back to them tomorrow in the question and answer session. Which one?
Do you have the
Michael?
Yeah. We don't have proper data on that yet, so it's a bit premature to look at that, but we will have to submit this as part of the impact assessment.
Okay, thanks Michael, thanks Carl. As I said, we will collect the questions and we will try to answer as many as possible tomorrow. That brings us to the last presentation before the lunch break, which is also related to rulemaking and Part 21. It's about the actual implementation of the new privileges, and Rob Berthmar, Senior DOA Team Leader for LOI and SMS, will guide you through this topic.
Good morning. In this presentation, I will be talking about the new privileges that we've added to Part 21, the published material, scope and criteria for these privileges, some of the principles, the process to obtain privilege and to extend the privilege, and some further guidance. Questions and answers at the end, please. So, on the new privileges, they introduce a possibility for DOA holders to by themselves, under this privilege, approve certain major changes, certain STCs, or certain major repairs. And we do that under quite strict conditions, and they are specified in the AMC material associated. So all these designs need to be similar in design, should be repetitive as far as the certification process is going. DOA needs to have good performance on these topics and have a low risk of the project itself, which is expressed by a low LOI likelihood. So the topic is very much linked to LOI, although it's not the same. You can consider this as a risk class 0 for LOI, but we really want to target projects where we know that the risk is very low, where we know that you as a DOA do a good job, and as a consequence, our review of data doesn't make a lot of sense. We would be spending time on something we already know. You are doing a good job, we know the certification processes you're using, we know the data you will be generating, so in that sense, our involvement should be very low, or even in these cases, 0. We published the following material. It was already mentioned before that in the amendment to Part 21, 2019-897, we changed the paragraph 263C, where a change has been made in paragraph 5 of that material, where we now talk about certain major repairs, and I'll come back to that later. We have 2 new privileges in there. One is for the certain major changes, and one is for certain STCs. Associated to that material, we have some further guidance. So there's 2 AMCs. AMC number 1 explains the scope of the new privilege and also the criteria for limitation and the eligibility of the new privilege. AMC number 2 talks about the process, how to obtain the privilege and how to extend the privilege. Guidance material on especially numbering system for the changes and repairs we're proposing. And we do have our internal department policy. That is relatively new. It's at issue 3 at the moment, and you can obtain it through your DOA team leaders. Issue 3, we felt that we should be able to disclose that to you. It's an internal department policy. It is something you can read and expect questions from the DOA team leader when you go for these new privileges, and you can anticipate a little bit on our thinking and what we would like to see when you start using such privileges. About the scope and criteria of these privileges. So the privileges are not for just any project, not just any major change, any SDC or any major repair. They are under very strict control and have a lot of prerequisites that you need to fulfill to make sure that indeed those projects are of a very low risk. So there are changes, and When I say changes, I mean STCs and repairs as well. I will just continue talking about changes. Changes similar to those that have been previously approved by EASA for the same DOA holder. So we need to have seen at least one of those projects from you and have certified that. You need to meet the eligibility criteria, and I will give a listing later. Sorry, yeah. There's an aspect to the repairs where we changed C5. So before C5 was already there was the option to have a major repair privileges. It was targeted at the TC holders for their own TCs, where TC holders were able to obtain this privilege and could approve by themselves major repairs to their own TCs, as well for STC holders that could approve major repairs to their own STCs. We've added two limitations. They were already there a little bit in the background. They are now more prominent within this AMC. So we need to talk to those that already had the privilege C5, that there are two exclusions for the use of this privilege. It would be a new interpretation of the certification basis. We need to be involved, and it needs to be an application to the agency in that case. Or you would have an application of a certification specification that is different from the one used for type certification. So again, it's a change of the certification basis. We need to be involved if the repair actually needs that. This would be very much an exception. I haven't seen any repair that needs that, but we just wanted to make sure that these limitations are very prominently in the AMC material, and we need to have a discussion with those that already have this privilege, that these are the limitations that are described in the procedures. Then we have the other case, where now anybody can receive a privilege on doing major repairs, again for those low-risk projects. So where you've already shown through an application of a major repair that the risk is low, that you have good DOA performance, and that you fulfill certain other conditions that I will come back to. So there's two aspects to the C5 privilege. It's very important to remember that. The AMC provides mostly exclusions where a privilege does not apply. And here's a listing, and there's a second sheet as well. So whenever the TCDS needs to be revised, the privilege can't apply. The only organization that can do that is the authority. So in that case, we need an application to revise the TCDS. Still, if it's a project that you've done repeatedly, we may have a low LOI. But that's a different story. That's then on the topic of LOI. Also, those projects that need an amendment to the existing certification basis are not eligible for doing it under the privilege. In principle, not eligible are those changes that need a revision of the awareness limitation section or operational limitations. But we also said we don't want to be fully black and white on this one. We need to have a discussion and a case-by-case evaluation if it's really repetitive, whether or not it can be done under the privilege. So there's a little asterisk for that one. Any changes triggered by an AD, I think it's very obvious that we want to be involved. If it's terminating action, for instance, to an AD, we need to be involved and need to approve that change. Similar to an AMOC to an AD. Here I just want to mention that currently, and we're going to revise it, the guidance material talks about ALTMOC. That's an error. ALTMOC is a different concept, so we need to talk about AMOCs to an AD, and also when a change is providing an AMOC to an AD, we need to be involved as authority, and therefore it does not fall under the privilege. It continues the list. Any significant changes, I think there it's also very clear that it does not fall under the privilege. If you apply more conservative requirements compared to the reference change, so if you've already done a project, but in this case, in the next case, you will apply more conservative requirements, we need to be involved. Also, when noise and emission characteristics are affected, as a principle, again, we said we don't want to be fully black and white here, so we can have a case-by-case evaluation if the things are really repetitive, that this still can be done under privileges. anything critical, critical characteristics or single failures with catastrophic effect would get you out of the low likelihood in LOI already. So again, they're not eligible for the privilege. For engines per pressure, as we don't have a catastrophic, of course here is the single failures with hazardous effects. And a specialty if you already hold the privilege, but on the reference project or on the changes you've already done, we found a non-compliance in the reference change. So anything during continued awareness process, we see something going wrong with that particular change, there might be an unsafe condition. Of course, then also for the next application of such a change, we need to be involved and make sure that the unsafe condition is addressed. Some of the principles on how to obtain the privilege. We start out with reference projects. We call them reference projects, so they form a basis of our review. You've applied for these reference projects. We know how you're working. We know the certification processes you'll be using for these particular types of projects. We also know how well you're doing that as a DOA, so meaning the DOA performance should be good. And with that, you can apply for the privilege or to extend the privilege later on. So here in a more positive note, not the exclusions, but where you can use the privilege for. So similarity with other changes already approved by EASA for the same DOA. So meaning the reference projects. There's a repetitiveness to the certification processes. You're not going to certify it in a completely different way. It is basically the same way you're going to certify these changes. You have a good performance as a DOA during the last projects, and the nature of the project is such that there is a low likelihood of risk as determined by doing the LOI evaluation and the risk-based approach during the reference projects. Of course, you also need to describe in your procedures how you're going to use this privilege, what documentation you're going to generate, and all of that good stuff. Once the privilege is granted, you can go ahead and use your privilege much in the same way as you do minor changes on the privilege. You can do these under the privilege, particularly for the projects that the privilege is applicable to. And this list of projects is called list associated with the privilege in the AMC. So this is a list you maintain as a DOA, but we always want to be there every step of the way. If you want to add a project to that list, we need to be there and have a look on such cases. As far as the reference projects go, ideally they are projects that you apply for under the LOI concept. So we get as output also things like low LOI likelihood. We get the DOA performance on that. As a minimum, there needs to be one, but there can be more than one. And we need to see what is best in a particular case. If you are intending to apply for a privilege or more than one privilege, we'd like you to separate the applications. Of course, the application needs to be done as a significant change. So please, if you want to do both major changes and STCs, there's companies that can do both. Please submit 2 significant changes so that one doesn't hold up the other one and we can evaluate them separately. It's just a matter of practicality. Of course, when I mentioned already before, when I talk about changes here in this diagram, you can replace change by either STC or repair. The principles are the same of the privileges. As a repeat, conditions for issue of the privilege, you need to have a reference project. We need to have LOI. If you've done a project in the past, in the recent past, but not yet done under LOI, you still would like to use it as a reference project, you think it's eligible to be used as a reference project, we need to fill the gap that not doing LOI on this project has left. So we need to do an extra exercise on that. We don't want to exclude it fully. The ideal case is you apply now under the LOI process, but some recent projects we may want to look at as well and use them as reference projects. Again, similarity, design, installation, operation, basically the same as in the reference project. We need these things to be quite the same. They're never 100% the same, but they need to be quite the same, so we know the risk is low, you are doing a good job, we know what type of job you're doing, meaning certification-wise, and therefore our involvement is not necessary. And that's also expressed by the repetitiveness of the certification process. Performance and experience. Of course, if during the reference project your performance as DOA is low, I think it would be silly to give you a privilege on that. We need to know that you are doing a good job. Low performance does not reflect that. According to the AMC, medium or high level is the means. Of course, we are aiming for a high level of the DOA. If the reference project showed a medium level of competence and performance of the DOA, we need to have a story on, okay, it was medium, this is what the company has done, this is what you as DOA have done, so next time it will be high, and we need to have the confidence in that. The door is open for medium performance, but there needs to be a story why on the next project it will be high. And of course, again, as mentioned, low likelihood during LOI. The process, in a nutshell, in practice it will be, there will be quite some bits involved. It starts with you, well, first of all, making up your mind if you think these privileges are useful to you as a DOA. Of course, you need to have those projects that are of this repetitive nature and are of a low risk. So if you don't have this project, all your projects are quite different from each other, a privilege doesn't make sense. If you do lots of repetitions, like you're installing each time almost a similar cabin into an aircraft, just as an example, or you're doing TICAS STCs with a lot of repetition, it might be something that you would want to think of. So if you decide to go for a privilege, you apply with a Form 82, so a significant change. You provide the procedure. You establish this list associated with the privilege. At least there should be one project on it. We're not going to approve a privilege with an empty list. There should be at least one project. You provide a justification document. So the justification document you provide is there to show to us that indeed you're fulfilling all the eligibility criteria for this project under the privilege. And then we will assess. For sure, the DOA team leader will make use of PCM and experts to assess, also to look at that reference project. What were the outcomes of this reference project? What were the details? And do we indeed agree that what you've provided in the justification document is indeed providing compliance with the eligibility criteria? If we're all happy with that, we will update the TOA. We will add the privilege to the list of privileges in the terms of approval. And there will be a limitation at the end that will refer to your document called the list associated with privileges. A little bit about the content of the justification document. For sure, we start with the reference project, compliance with the criteria, the certification program, related possible types and models, also for a dedicated product if the type of model has no technical influence. Yeah, it's working again. The list of requirements and corresponding certification process, if not identical to reference certification programs. So, of course, these changes must be small, but we do allow some flexibility in there. A detailed description of the project or projects and what we're talking about, and any other limits on the use of the privilege. Sometimes you need to apply limits to the project that is applicable under the privilege to make sure you're fulfilling the eligibility criteria. So there's tools you can use to put limits on it. It's not open-ended. Not putting limits would not fulfill always the eligibility criteria, so sometimes you can impose on yourself certain limitations for use of this privilege, and then it will work under that particular privilege for that particular project. Once we have established that you will have the privilege, and there will be this list associated with the privilege, as I mentioned before, with at least one project on it. How do we extend this list with new projects? Of course, you do not want just one project on it. In most of the cases, you would want to do several projects to be applicable under this privilege. So it's not done through a significant change. It's not done through an update of the terms of approval, but we do want to review. So it's an in-between process where we want to do away with all the administrative burden. You mentioned to the DOA team leader that you're wanting to apply another project for under the privilege. The DOA team leader will then review the justification document you provided. It's basically the same thing as with the initial application of the privilege, but without the significant change application. When we accept, you update the list associated with the privileges, because this is your document. On the particular topic of repairs, for the use of the repair privilege under the existing or the previous C5, there's no change. Yeah, so we don't want to go in there applying new or having a list associated with the privilege. It will basically be the same. It's just those two preconditions that you need to add to your procedures. And for repairs, the repair privilege on the other side of C5, so for any other DOA, not the TC holder of the product or not the STC holder of the particular change. As I just mentioned, check the eligibility, provide the justification document. We accept if we all agree, and then you can update the privilege, the list associated with the privilege. Again, we don't want to make it too burdensome, so we want to avoid having to update the TOA each time. It is done by you updating that list with our knowledge. I do not intend to take you through these flow charts. I just want to have the picture here on the screen. We could if you wanted to, but in the interest of time. These are the flow charts that take you through the process. They are a direct copy from the AMC, so please have a look. I think they're very useful to guide you through the process, just a step-by-step guide to get you to a successful application of the privilege. Some further guidance. The guidance material itself proposes a numbering system. Why are we doing that? Of course, you can decide for yourself, but we want these things to be recognizable. Your customers, if we all can agree and use the same numbering system, will recognize it as an STC of EASA. I think that's very important, especially in the beginning, where your customers will have to get used to that they get an STC that is approved directly by the DOA without EASA involvement. So that's why we're proposing a numbering system. We're also proposing to use an approval form. They look very much like the EASA certificates we normally provide for major changes, STC, or major repairs. They even have almost the same numbering. There's just a 9 in front of it. That's just for recognizability. So we encourage the use of these forms. You don't have to do it, of course. It's guidance material. But if everybody uses these forms in the same format, also your customers will recognize it. They will know what they have in their hands. And I think that's useful for everybody. So it's very much encouraged. The internal policy that I mentioned at the beginning gives some steps, and like I said, expect questions to be asked from the DOA team leader according this policy, so have a look at that. If you didn't get a copy yet of that policy, please ask your DOA team leader. And of course, have the discussion, have an open discussion with the DOA team leader. Also, when you intend to apply for a project that will become a reference project, make that known to the DOA team leader, also to the certification team, so we already can take into account, we can gather upfront the experience and anticipate that you will apply for the privilege later on. Thank you for your attention. Any questions?
Well, thanks, Rob. There are plenty of questions, I can tell you.
Oh, no.
Yes. If you can bring the Slido screen to the front. Thanks. The first one, for example, how to perform validations. as far as I understand it, we have the tip and we accept each other's system. This change of the system should still be covered by the tip, so it is covered
Yes.
by the tip.
So we did discuss and inform the FAA on what we're doing here, so they know. Validation will go through us, of course, according to the validation principles. You submit your data to us, we will pass it on to the FAA, but we will have a look, of course. We're not going to blindly be postmasters and just hand it to the FAA. We will have a look to such data, such design data. But in principle, it's the same system. Would the STC approval under this new privilege be equivalent to an STC issued by EASA and listed in the EASA STC database? Yes. So what we want from you is that once you have approved a project under privilege, that you send us the data for that project for inclusion in the list. And yes, it is exactly the same. It's an approved STC that is generated under the EASA system, much in the same way as your minor changes are recognized under the EASA system. There's no difference in the application. Would privileges be time limited? That's a very good question, I think. The policy document gives some guidance on this. So we say the privilege does not expire. What we do want you to have in your procedure when you want to do a project under privilege, of course you need to check this project is eligible to be done under this privilege. And one of those points could be where you say, well, what was the last time we've done this project? Was it 5 years ago? Did all my staff change? Did the way I'm working change? Should this still be applicable? Should I still be using this privilege? Or does it not apply anymore? So from the rule, there's no expiration date or anything like that for the projects on the list or the privilege itself. But we do want you to have a sensible process in your procedures that evaluates this. And that's what the DOA team leader will be looking for. For those certain changes, we will follow the same approach as per the minor changes, namely will not apply to EASA, correct? Yes, that is correct. So there's no application to EASA, no fee for the application to be paid to EASA, just to anticipate that question. And it will be much in a similar way as the minors. Of course, it's not fully the same. For instance, on the STCs, you need to send us the STC so we can include them in the list. How many reference projects do we need? Minimum one. If the one describes your project completely, we're satisfied LOI-wise. We have a low likelihood all of the boxes can be ticked properly by just using this single reference project. We would be okay with that. If you want to widen the use of that particular project under the privilege, but we only saw one aspect during a single project, then we might need to see more projects. So also there you can be smart about what do we put initially on the list of projects, and maybe you can extend it later on the basis of new projects you're doing. Also there, maybe it's good to say at this moment, if you are applying for an STC, let's take an STC example, and you want to provide this STC on a series of aircraft, and the first STC application is on one particular aircraft. Be very conscious of the fact that certification bases of aircraft differ, and choose wisely on what the STC certification basis will be, so that your certification basis covers a wide range of those aircraft types you're intending to offer your STC on. So if you do that smartly, then the privilege will apply to many projects. If you start with an older aircraft and use the certification basis of that aircraft as per the TCDS, you might struggle arguing to us that it also will apply to an aircraft with a newer certification basis.
Okay, maybe two more questions before we break for lunch.
So the classification, the first one is interesting. The classification of a new change often takes account of similar designs previously approved as major. This can result in a minor change. He has a comment. Yes, I do have a comment. What is major on an aircraft is tomorrow major is in 10 years major. So we look at the appreciable effect it has on the aircraft. What it doesn't feature in the evaluation of a classification is DOA competence, DOA experience, etc. So if there is an appreciable effect on the aircraft, the change should be classified as major, period. That should be it.
There are a number of questions that link this new privilege to LOI and the performance of LOI rules. Can you respond on that a little bit?
Is it necessary that the reference projects have been performed under LOI rules? Basically, yes. As I mentioned, we want the reference project to be done under LOI. We need as output a low likelihood. That's LOI speak. That's how we get to that point. We can look at recent projects not done under LOI where we fill the gap. So we do the LOI, or you do the LOI exercise after the project has already been certified, maybe in this year or the year before. I don't want to look at too old projects, but if you've done a recent project where LOI was not done formally yet, we can fill the gap by doing the LOI exercise with hindsight. Yes.
Okay, thanks, Rob. We still have a number of questions, and we will park them again and we'll try to respond to as many as possible in the summary tomorrow. Some of them are duplications, so we will possibly limit the number a little bit. With that, we finished the morning session, which was focusing on rulemaking, Part 21, new basic regulation. You have a well-deserved lunch break. We are a bit late, but could you try to be back at 1:30 for the continuation then with cybersecurity? Thank you.